Now, as impressive, right, as impressive as these speeches are in the book of Acts, we have something even better than that. It's almost hard to believe. When I first got exposed to this evidence as a younger person, I had just heard from so many different skeptics that these things were legends that developed decades and centuries later. Maybe you've heard some of that garbage before, but when I first got exposed to this stuff from actual, professional historians, I was just blown away how they have traced back how early some of these sources are that discuss Jesus's miracles and resurrection. So if you were impressed by those speeches in Acts, hold on to your pants because we're going back even closer to Jesus's life. This is really, really incredible. What I'm referring to is Paul's letters, okay? There's some things discovered that historians have discovered in Paul's letters that can be dated, and historians do date these things even earlier than the speeches in Acts. So let's slowly walk through how Ehrman lays this out. So Ehrman explains that the Apostle Paul is our earliest surviving Christian author of any kind. Many readers of the Bible assume that the Gospels were the first books of the New Testament to be written, since they appear first in order of the New Testament, and they discuss the life of Jesus, who obviously started the whole movement. But Paul was actually writing some years before the Gospels. His first letter, 1 Thessalonians, is usually dated. We can get even more specific with Paul's letters because of the things that he includes in his letters and such, is usually dated to the 40s, 49. Is Ehrman's date for 1 Thessalonians. And his last probably was Romans, which is dated 12 to 13 years after that. So early 60s, okay? So we can date, and Ehrman does this as well, most all of Paul's letters then in the 50s, right? Paul wrote his epistles in the 50s. I'm just putting some of the major ones on the timeline. I'm not putting them all there because that would take too much space and be too many details on a slide. But we have Galatians, late 40s to early 50s, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, mid 50s, and Romans, probably the last letter he wrote that we have in the New Testament, in the mid to late 50s. These are the ranges that Ehrman gives. Now, you should be aware that there is some debate about some of Paul's letters in the New Testament. You guys are familiar that in our New Testament, there are 13 letters supposedly from Paul. And historians are very, very confident about these on the left. Okay, so there's just so much historical evidence that Paul wrote these that there isn't really any debate about Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. Nobody debates that. Everybody agrees that those were written by Paul because there's just so much strong historical evidence for it. There is good, strong historical evidence that those other ones were written by Paul, just not as strong of historical evidence. So those are debated. If you wade into this material, you will see people debate these other letters, whether they were really written by Paul or not. There's good historical evidence, just not as much. It's kind of like we discussed before, Jesus having brothers and Jesus having sisters, right? We just have tons of sources that say he had brothers. So historians are very confident about that. Only one source says he has sisters. So just wearing our historians' hats, we can't be as confident about that. We can't dismiss that Jesus had sisters because we only have one source. Just can't be as confident about it. Similarly with these books, whether they were written by Paul or not. Good historical evidence for those on the right, just not as much as those on the left. Okay, here's what Ehrman sums up concerning what Paul wrote. And he's going to concentrate on the ones on the left, of course, because those have just the most historical evidence they were written by Paul. So Ehrman is summing up what we find in Paul. He says, Paul mentions that Jesus was born, that he was a Jew, a direct descendant of King David. He had brothers. one of them named James. He had a ministry to Jews, had 12 disciples. He was a teacher, anticipated his own death. He had a Last Supper on the night he was handed over. He was killed at the instigation of Jews in Judea, and he died by crucifixion. He also refers on several occasions to Jesus' teachings. Now, Ehrman is making this point because some mythicists will say that Paul didn't really talk about the historical Jesus at all, but that's just not the case, and Ehrman's pointing that out here. Paul was so convinced that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah that he used the term Christ, which is translated Messiah, as one of Jesus' actual names. Now, in terms of predicting his own death, Ehrman is convinced of this, okay? So you can think of this maybe as a miracle, prophesying his own death. But take a look at what Ehrman wrote concerning, he mentions it briefly in this quote, but in a latter section he goes into more depth. This is, you might remember the account at the Last Supper where Jesus tells his disciples that he's going to be handed over and killed. Ehrman says, this is not some vague mythological reference, but a concrete historical one. Paul knows Jesus had a Last Supper with his disciples, and he knows that Jesus predicted his approaching death, the very night he was handed over to the authorities. Now, Paul's letters are very early. We've seen it on the timeline. Paul's letters were written, most of them in the 50s. So we're talking 20 years, after Jesus' life and ministry, which is pretty close, right? 20 years, that's pretty good for historical investigation, especially when we're talking about something that supposedly took place 2,000 years ago. But there are things found within Paul's letters that can be dated even earlier than the letters themselves, similar to the speeches in Acts. But let's take a look at these things that scholars have discovered in Paul's letters. What historians have identified in several of Paul's letters are ancient creeds. Now, we all know what a creed is. Sometimes we recite the Apostles' Creed, for example. Creeds in all religions, all belief systems have creeds. Creeds are just a short, little, pithy statement that summarizes our key beliefs. And creeds are usually done that way so they can be memorized and repeated and taught to the next generation. So we know what a creed is. The early Christians had creeds as well. And scholars have identified in Paul's letters where he quotes some of these early creeds. So in fact, scholars have identified 41 creeds in Paul's letters that he's quoting. So if Paul is quoting these creeds in the 50s, obviously we know that these creeds date then earlier than the 50s, if Paul is quoting them. So where did Paul get these creeds? Now this is going to be a little bit detailed, but bear with me, it involves a little bit of math. But look at how Ehrman describes this situation. Where did Paul get these creeds? Where did Paul get all this received accounts, these creeds? He's specifically talking in this context about these creeds. And most important, when did he get them? Well, Paul indicates in Galatians 1 that originally, before his conversion, he'd been a fierce persecutor of the church of Christ. But then on the basis of some kind of mysterious revelation, he came to see that Jesus really was the Son of God, and he converted to Christianity. After 3 years after his conversion, he tells us he made a trip to Jerusalem. And there he spent 15 days with Cephas and James. Now Cephas was one of Jesus' 12 disciples, and James was one of Jesus' brothers. Now this is a very, very important piece of historical evidence. Take a look at what Ehrman says concerning this trip of Paul to go see Cephas and James. Ehrman wrote, Paul also names one of the brothers of Jesus, and it's none other than James, also mentioned by Mark. The comment comes in Galatians chapter 1, one of those rare autobiographical statements of Paul in which he reflects back on his life and indicates what he did after his conversion. And then he quotes some verses from Galatians. After 3 years, I went to Jerusalem to consult with Cephas, and I remained with him for 15 days. I did not see any of the other apostles except James, the brother of the Lord. What I'm writing to you, I tell you before God, I'm not lying. When Paul swears he's not lying, this is back to Airman now, when Paul swears he's not lying, I generally believe him. During those 15 days, he saw Cephas and James and no one else. Now this is important for two reasons, as Airman's going to explain. This is important for two reasons. First of all, because we've got now Paul interviewing, if you will, or talking to direct eyewitnesses. Airman explains that Cephas, of course, was Simon Peter, Jesus' closest disciple, and James was the Lord's brother. And these are two very good people to know if you want to know anything about the historical Jesus. I wish I knew them. And so in the letter here to Galatians, Paul states as clearly as possible that he knew Jesus' brother. Can we get any closer to an eyewitness account than this? Paul knows one of these brothers personally. It's hard to get much closer to the historical Jesus than that. So we've got direct eyewitnesses, right? Jesus' brother and Peter. And the second reason why this account in Galatians is so important is that it tells us this material, these creeds, come from very, very early, close to the dates when Jesus did his ministry. So this is a long quote, I apologize, but I think it's worth taking a look at. Ehrman wrote, when scholars then crunch all the numbers that Paul mentions, it appears that he must have converted in the early 30s, say 32, 33, just 1 to 3 years after the death of Jesus. This means that if Paul went to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and James 3 years after his conversion, he would have seen them and received the traditions, the creeds, that he later gives in his letters, around the middle of the decade, say the year 35 or 36. The traditions he inherited from Cephas and James, of course, were older than that, and so must date to just a couple of years or so after Jesus' death. We don't have to wait for the Gospel of Mark around 70 to hear about the historical Jesus, as mythicists are fond of claiming. This evidence from Paul dovetails perfectly with what we find in the Gospel accounts, whose oral accounts almost certainly go also back to the 30s. Paul too shows that just a few years after Jesus' life, his followers were talking about the things he said, did, and experienced as a Jewish teacher in Palestine who was crucified by the Romans at the instigation of the Jewish authorities. This is a powerful confluence of evidence, the sources of the Gospels and the accounts of our earliest Christian author. So these creeds are extremely early material. Historians, including Ehrman and others, through this historical process, taking Paul's account from Galatians 1, date these creeds then to the early to mid-30s. So you might say, okay, we've got these early creeds. Now, do these early creeds describe Jesus as just a good, nice guy who taught some good moral teachings, and then the account of his miracles and resurrection, those are just legends that developed decades and centuries later? What do these creeds say? How do these early creeds, which historians date to just within a year or two of Jesus' death, how do they describe Jesus? We'll take a look at probably the most famous creed. I'm sure you guys are familiar with it. It's found in 1 Corinthians 15. But take a look at this famous creed found in Paul's letters and how it describes Jesus. Just a good moral teacher, or as a miracle worker that rose from the dead. Take a look. Again, this is quoting from Ehrman. There are solid reasons for thinking Paul understood Jesus to have died recently. I can start with the basic confession, the basic creed of faith that Paul lays out in 1 Corinthians, a confession that was passed along to him by those who came before him. As it states, for what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance. That's what gives historians the clue that this is a creed. He received it, and now he's passing it on. But Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and then he appeared to Peter and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep, passed away. And in the very next paragraph, Ehrman explains the importance of this creed. Take a look at this. Ehrman wrote, several points are worth emphasizing here about this creed. This ancient creed is neatly balanced. It's a poetical statement, as a lot of creeds are, easier to memorize, with two halves. In both halves, it makes a claim about Christ, that he died and then he was raised, indicates the claim is in accordance with the scriptures, and then offers empirical proof. That he died is proved by the fact that he was buried, and that he was raised is proved by the fact that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. So we've got very, very, very early sources talking about Jesus' resurrection. Clearly, this couldn't have been a legend that developed decades later, because people were talking about it almost immediately after it supposedly took place. This is why atheist scholars like Ehrman, and here's another atheist scholar, Gerd Ludemann, will admit that from historical analysis, we know the disciples were proclaiming Jesus' resurrection no later than 2 years after the cross.